the right, but here's someone who is doing wrong to them. And I'm asking you to be a righteous, a wrathful judge upon them because of that. These are the Psalms that are almost universally recognized as imprecatory. There are others. It's these other divisions, these categories, depends on who you ask as to what category they best fit under. And then below, as I've shown this before, we have some samples of verses that are imprecatory, even though the whole Psalm is not necessarily of the imprecatory nature. Okay, tonight we're going to go to Psalm 35 first, if you want to turn there and have it. Now, oh, wait a minute, I was going to think before I got to that, but you won't need to, you still hold your finger at Psalm 35 there. There's something called the characteristic of being self-imprecatory. And you can probably guess that what that is. That means you're calling down a curse or evil upon yourself if a certain situation exists. They're always prefaced with an if. Dennis mentioned Job to me last week after we had class. We were talking about this. He talked about Job 29, 30, and 31, those chapters. And as we get down to chapter 31 toward the end, we have Job saying, well, actually the whole chapter really, just the first few verses introduced it, then from chapter or verse 5 on down to verse 40. Job is saying, Lord, if I have done this, then you need to do this to me. If I have done this, you need to do this. If I mistreated a widow, then I deserve this punishment. If I've been unkind to somebody, then do this to me. It's self-imprecatory. But the thing was, Job did not recognize himself as having done those things. But he's saying, Lord, you know, if I've done these things, then I'm worthy of what you're going to do to me. But since I've not done them, I don't understand what's happening to me. But we talked about Job plenty, so we won't go back there and relive that. But that's self-imprecatory. We also have Psalm 7, a situation where David says something similar. We're not going to go into a lot of that tonight. But verses 3 through 5, especially, David's talking about in a self-imprecatory way. And he's saying, Lord, you know, if I've done this injustice, then, you know, you need to punish me. He said, may my right arm fall off the shoulder. May my arm pull out of its socket and things like that. In other words, you know, I deserve this if I'm guilty, as these enemies are trying to accuse me. But of course, in that particular situation, at least, to deserve what his enemies were doing to him. So that's self-imprecatory. And the ones I'm familiar with are always like this. It's the if. If this is true, then this is what I deserve. Speaking of oneself. Of course, the imprecatory Psalms we're going to be looking at have to do with other people. Either someone who is mistreating an individual, usually David, all but one of these will be written by David, or society in general, in which those in charge of justice are not doing a good job of it, and people are suffering. It's called societal imprecation sometimes. And then a whole nation. Sometimes when a whole nation is punished, as we'll look at in Psalm 137, by the waters of Babylon. And we'll look at that in just a few moments. So individual, societal, and a whole nation could be indicated by being mistreated and respond with an imprecatory, or someone on their behalf could respond with an imprecatory psalm, which is also, if you say an imprecatory prayer, you're right. You know, you can call them either way because these represent statements, don't they? They've been recorded to us, and we think of them as psalms, but remember, that's something that went from the heart of David, or whoever was writing, to the mind of God directly. And so it was an imprecatory prayer as well. So let's look at Psalm 35 now. And this is one in which David has a personal enemy or enemies in which he is speaking in an imprecatory way. And we'll look at verses 1 through 8. Plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Doesn't sound too bad so far, does it, Lord? You know, here's some people that are my enemies. Enemies of right, you know, help me defeat them. Take hold of shield and buckler and stand up for my help. Also draw out the spear and stop those who pursue me. So the weapons of war, of course, he's speaking metaphorically. The Lord doesn't need weapons like that, but he's saying, Lord, put your great power to work as though it were weapons to help me defeat these people who are trying to hurt me. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. Let those be put to shame and brought to dishonor who seek after my life. Let those be turned back and brought to confusion who plot my hurt. Now, as you read that, you might think of Saul, first of all, because Saul was seeking David's life, you know, and tried to take his life a couple of times or more, specifically. But it could be other cases too. We don't know for sure which it was, but we know David was struggling with this situation. Here's what he says of his enemies. Let them be like chaff before the wind, and let the angel of the Lord chase them. And there's a period missing right there. I'm not sure how that happened in the sentence, but let's start with that first sentence at this point. The chaff before the wind. The chaff was the light stuff. When you threw the grain up in the air, the grains of whatever wheat or barley or whatever you had would come back down because they were heavier. What happened to the chaff? It went whichever way the wind took it. The chaff was helpless before the wind, in a kind of personification way there. So David is saying, Lord, let those who are my enemies, who are abusing me, let them be like that, and let you be the great wind that blows them away, and they're helpless before you. You know, there are some winds that are so strong in nature, you know, that we couldn't stand before them. So that's a picture there. David's enemies being blown away by the mighty force of God. Let the angel of the Lord pursue them, or let their way be dark and slippery, and let the angel of the Lord pursue them. Traveling at night back in those days was especially tedious. If you did not have sufficient light with you, and not having the light sources that we have today, it was dangerous sometimes. It could be slippery because, for one thing, the limestone hillsides where they might be traveling, where, you know, it might be one way that had been traveled for a long time because it was, as far as elevation and ease of travel, that was the best way to go. But what happens after you travel long enough, even on a limestone rock? It gets smooth. It gets smooth and slippery. If you're traveling with just very little light, again, it could be hazardous travel. Or if it came just a light mist of rain, what happens to a smooth rock then? It becomes even more hazardous. So David is calling upon a difficult situation for his enemies, who were, instead of them getting to pursue him, Lord, let the angel of the Lord pursue them. Let mischief fall upon them. Let their travels be difficult, slippery, and dark. For without cause, and there's another key thing, in all of these cases that we read about, is we understand, and of course, taking it as inspired word, we would understand that David, or whoever was being mistreated, who spoke the imprecatory prayer or psalm, were in that case righteous. They were right. They weren't calling upon the Lord for something that wasn't fair. They weren't guilty of a bunch of things, and whatever was happening to them, they brought on themselves. That wasn't the case. And David says, and of course, you know, the Lord had this preserved for us by inspiration, so we would take it to be true, without cause. He was righteous. They were guilty of pursuing the righteous. They have hidden their net for me in a pit, which they have dug without cause for my life. And you read what people have to say about the net and the pit, you get all kinds of ideas. But I don't see a real difficulty with it from those who say that in those days they might dig a pit for a wild animal. But of course, what do you do with the wild animal when you've got him in a pit then? You know, how do you let go of the ears of an angry dog? You know, it's kind of tricky, isn't it? How do you get a wild animal out of a pit? Well, apparently they would dig the pit and they would put the net already in there, but down low enough that it was not able to be seen, and then cover it up with something the animal would fall through. So when the wild animal fell down, you already had him in a net. All you had to do is draw up the sides of the net, and you had him, and you could pull him out even that way if you had enough manpower. So sort of a double trap there. So David said, they've got a pit for me. They got a net down there, got it covered. Just wait for me to fall in it, and I'll be helpless, and they'll pull me up in that net, and then they can kill me. And without cause. David had not brought this on himself in this case. Let destruction come upon him, his enemy, unexpectedly, and let his net that he has hidden catch himself. Into that very destruction, let him fall. In other words, this elaborate trap that he's laid for me, let him fall in it himself. And do people sometimes, fall both literally and metaphorically, fall into traps they set for other people sometimes. They're harmed by that which they intend to catch or harm an animal. Instead of me, because they're doing this without cause. So that's an imprecatory psalm of a personal nature, because David was the one who was at risk in this case, one who was being chased, and so forth. So that's one example that we want to look at. Any comments? Thoughts on that one? Well, I would understand that we could take to God all these feelings that we have like this because we're leaving it with God. We're not taking personal vengeance. We're leaving it with God. And of course, we're not really saying anything God doesn't already know. We're just expressing ourselves before God. God, here's the way people are treating me. And you know that I've not brought this on myself. And you know that justice is called for. And then leave it with God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We talked a little bit about that last week. We're going to talk some more toward the end. And it is a totally different tone than what, Jesus asks us for is praying for our enemies. Mm-hmm. But, well, sometimes when we undergo certain things, uh, we may be feeling some of these emotions right here. And it seems to me it would be much better to share these with God than to act upon them or to dwell upon them. I see David as turning these over to God and saying, God, man, here's what I'm going through. I need you to help me. And then hopefully at some point, and we noted, I think, at some point we talked about David even forgiving his enemies. Like that guy that stood up on the hillside and threw rocks down at him when he was running away from Saul, running for his life. There was a sense of forgiveness in David, but there was a time in his life when he struggled. And he said, these enemies are just really tearing me up. I need your help. Those were his thoughts then. Yeah, I think we would see David as probably coming around to a different approach, like I say, because he did forgive people. There were people who took a side against him. He even, worked for Saul first, were loyal to Saul, and then came back to him. He forgave them and accepted them back, like Abner. Okay. Okay. If I understood Ron, he's saying even not beyond a person, but something else that you're struggling with. What you're doing is turning it over to God, saying, God, I need you to handle this for me. Help me with this. Uh, And sometimes we do, honestly, because we're human and we can't control every thought. We may think imprecatory things. And then, we slap ourselves in the face figuratively, and we say, no, I've got to forgive them, even though they're my enemies. But we have to admit that at some point we struggle with it. It takes a while to forgive. Jonathan, and then June, and then I saw another hand, and then Bart. Okay. We may not get to any more Psalms tonight. Jonathan? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Jonathan suggests that David wasn't really, didn't have the story of Job in his heart, understanding that not everything happens because you bring it on yourself. And that we do need to, realize that God might have a higher plan. And we don't know a whole lot about Job. I guess we can assume that Job was there to be read by David. I don't know if we could prove that if we wanted to get down to evidence. That's an interesting thought. Jen? Okay. Jen points out that, it was David not bringing this on himself. It was without cause. And today we might want to pray this same thing, but we stop and think about it. We might have done something to bring that about. We might not have been as harmless in the situation as David was. And of course, I think that's kind of where maybe Jonathan's point comes in there. We just need to remember that God's got a bigger plan. And that's why he tells us to bring everything to him, and also tells us you need to forgive your enemy. Pray for him. Bart? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bart, in case you couldn't hear it all, Bart points out that David was running for his life, at times like this, many times. And, he might be hiding in a cave, and these words might have come to him, and he spoke them to God, and he might have been outnumbered in soldiers. But here he was, God's anointed to be the next king, and yet people were trying to kill him. A little bit different than some situations we might have today. And Bart mentioned self-defense, and kind of what it was. Lord, I need you to defend me, which is interesting because he'd already been told he was going to be the next king, but I guess he was still showing his dependence on God, even though God had made him, made known his plan for him to be king. Good comments. Let's go on if we can, because I'd like to get at least these other two in. Psalm 58, if you want to turn to that. This is what sometimes is called imprecatory statements about a societal enemy. one who's hurting society, such as those who are making decisions, such as judges, some counsel or something like that. David perhaps, and this is speculation, but perhaps is thinking about all these people who were part of Israel and who knew what Saul was trying to do to him. But, as far as people being around Saul, who was the one that stood up for David? Jonathan, that's about it. Why there were people, there were elders, there were leaders, there were Jewish people of power, that should have been saying, well, we need to talk to Saul about this. He doesn't need to be doing this. And David is sort of indicting those with judgmental powers who weren't helping. Or perhaps that was the setting here. We cannot be sure. Okay. Do you indeed speak righteousness, you silent ones? That's what leads us to believe it might be those who should have spoken up and did not to defend David. Do you judge uprightly, you sons of men? No, in your heart you work wickedness. You weigh out the violence of your hands in the earth. The wicked are estranged from the womb. In other words, you've been evil all your life, which of course is a metaphor because they weren't evil the day they were born, but they've been evil for a long time. It's just been their nature. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. And it's like the poison of the serpent. They are like the deaf cobra that stops its ear. And don't know that cobra is the perfect word there. It's more just a viper in general. And that's an interesting phrase that I want us to talk about a little bit there. We picture snake charmers of old and maybe some parts of the world today. When I was reading up on this, I found out that in some countries they've outlawed that. You can't. They don't want people, sitting on the little blanket and the snake in the basket and playing, music back and forth and the snake waving. And but anyway, it was, snake charmers back then. That's been around a long time, as far as we can tell. And these enemies that David's talking about here, well, they were potent for one thing, but they had the poison of a venomous serpent, and like the deaf viper that stops its ear. Now, literally, the scientists tell us it's not so much the hearing as it is the waving of the guy who's blowing the little pipe, which I read the name for it. I don't remember what it was. It's got a little special name. That, so-called charming the snake. Well, the snake is really following him back and forth because he perceives that guy with the little thing as a threat. And so he's watching him closely, So it's not really charming the snake at all. But what we have here is a picture of the snake that is not listening. It's just ready to strike. It's ready to attack. And that's the way the enemies were of David, like this viper that, you couldn't even charm it. It was ready to attack. They had, different species of vipers back then, they say, that were like that. They, rather than being passive and just, trying to get away from you, they were actually aggressive. So that's what this was. People you couldn't reason with. It didn't matter whether you did anything to offend them or not. They were in attack mode from the word go. Which will not heed the voice of charmers, charming ever so skillfully. Break their teeth in their mouth, O God. That's pretty rough, isn't it? Break their teeth in their mouth. These were the enemies of David that should have been perhaps intervening for him. Break out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them flow away as waters which run continually. When he bends his bow, let his arrows be as if cut in pieces. So, you can't shoot an arrow that's cut in pieces, can you? It just doesn't work. You've got to have a one-piece arrow. Let them be like a snail which melts away as it goes. You know how a snail leaves a little trail behind? And if it doesn't get rehydrated somewhere along the way, pretty soon it dries up. like a stillborn child of a woman, that they may not see the sun. So David's calling for some very, very strenuous punishment for these people. Before your pots can feel the burning thorns, he shall take them away as with a whirlwind, as is his living and burning wrath. He's speaking of God intervening. When they burned thorns back then, thorns burned quickly. They popped a lot, but the fire started quickly and started to burn very quickly. So that was a wood that was used when it had to be used. And David says, God's going to take care of it. You know how quick God's going to take care of it? Before you can start a fire with thorns and get the fire up to the pot. That's how quick God's going to intervene and his justice is going to be done, which reflects confidence in God that David had here, whatever we may think of his imprecatory nature. The righteous shall rejoice when he sees the vengeance. He shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked, so that men will say, sure is a reward for the righteous. Surely he is God who judges in the earth. Now notice the last part of this verse here, or the last verse. Here's part of what God's justice does. Here's part of why the imprecatory approach, has something to be said for it. Because why does David want this? Is it personal vengeance? Is he saying, I'm the most important person on this planet, and God, if anybody hurts me, you ought to hurt them very badly? No. So that everybody will see righteousness. God takes care of the righteous. And there is a God who judges in the earth. There's going to be a separation between the righteous and the wicked. And there is. And people need to know that. And so David was appealing to that knowledge, not so much, I want to get even with somebody. But Lord, I want you to be vindicated in this situation. Okay? And we've really got to hurry to even get one more in, but let's try to do it. Turn to Psalm 137 with me. This is a different one. The other 5 that I had planned on talking about tonight, and we're maybe going to get to one more after this, maybe not, are penned by David according to the superscriptions, the titles above them in the old Hebrew text. Not inspired as far as we know, but very, very old, so probably correct. Psalm 137 we just don't know, but we do know that it does not like anything that was related to David's life. And it sure looks like it's a totally different time period that would remove it from David. So let's look at it. By the way, this is one in which the imprecatory words are spoken about a national enemy, one that was a whole nation against another nation, in this case, Babylon against the Jews. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remember Zion. Those of you who are old enough and heard some pop songs back several decades ago, a couple of different groups made a song out of this that actually made the charts. Kind of hard to imagine there, but they sang about the waters of Babylon, where they changed the words a little bit, different translation, but they made this into a tune that actually was somewhat popular. And of course, the Psalms are poetic. That's one reason that we take the imprecatory Psalms in a different tone of being poetry rather than some of the other types of literature. We wept when we remember Zion. Here are these Jews beside the Euphrates, beside canals that came to the Euphrates that made Babylon a very powerful and fruitful place because water was that important. And they had canals everywhere as far as we can tell. And here's some Jews sitting beside the river, a place where they could get away, where it was quiet perhaps, because they'd been taken away from their homeland. They were where they could not worship like they used to. The temple was nowhere around. The temple, in fact, had been destroyed when they were taken to captivity. And they were just sitting around melancholy down by the riverside or down by the canal side. And, there we were, and we just wept, thinking about what we'd lost as a people and as individuals. We hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. When you hang up your harp, what are you not doing? You're not playing any music anymore. Why? Because we don't feel like playing music. We're thinking about the sadness. For there those who carried us away captive asked us of a song, and those who plundered us requested mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. They apparently were known for their songs, their musical abilities in playing the harps and the songs that they sang. And as far as we can tell, we don't know whether this request was made genuine or it was made just to make them feel worse. You know, it could have been somebody trying to be ugly to them. You know, those songs you play back in Jerusalem, come on, get your harps out. Could have been like that. Or it could have been a genuine interest on the Babylonians' parts. You know, we'd like to hear one of those songs that you sang. It's beautiful. But they didn't feel like singing. They didn't feel like singing because they were hundreds of miles away from their home and their heritage had been taken away from them. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? You just couldn't do it. You know, the atmosphere wasn't right. It was sadness. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill if I do not remember you. A little bit of precatory there. You know, the writer was saying on behalf of the Jews in Babylon, you know, if I ever forget Jerusalem, Lord, let me forget the ability to play these songs in the first place. And of course, they wouldn't forget Jerusalem because that was their home. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Lord, if your city where your temple used to be is not my number one thing, I deserve these things that I've just mentioned here. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom. Here's where it gets imprecatory for the enemies. Against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem. He said, raise it to its very foundation. Remember what Obadiah says about Edom? Yeah, read Obadiah. We don't have time to even look at it, but Obadiah 1, verses 10 through 12. He comes down hard on Edom because God had told him to, of course, because Edom, their attitude as Jews were being marched out of Jerusalem and marched to Babylon to captivity, Edom, it's as if they stood there and clapped their hands. Now, I don't let this literally happen, but that was their attitude. You know, you've met your end now. And they rejoiced when Jerusalem fell and when people were taken away. And Obadiah, speaking for God, said, Edom, you're not even going to exist much longer. You're going to be taken away and you will never be restored. And they weren't. Oh, so that's imprecatory toward Edom, which of course was certainly God's will. Oh, daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed, happy the one who repays you as you have served us. So a little bit of sarcasm there, along with the imprecatory nature. Babylon, you're going to get yours too. And they did. Happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Now, that's the viciousness that they were back then in some cases when armies captured another people. Sometimes they didn't take them prisoners. Sometimes they took no prisoners, and they were vicious and violent and doing things we wouldn't even want to think about. That's what was coming to Babylon. And whoever is writing this imprecatory Psalm 137 was talking about that. Okay, now we're going to have to move so that we can get a couple things that I want to say. Psalm 69, we would have talked about if we had more time. I introduced a little bit of that to you in our first lesson last week as we thought about this. Let their table become a snare and their well-being a trap. In other words, the good things for them, let the good things turn into bad things. Let their dwelling place be desolate, no one live in their tents. Talk of the grief of those you have wounded, add iniquity to their iniquity. Let them not come into your righteousness. Let them be blotted out from the book of living and not be written with the righteous because they were totally wicked. Psalm 109, also written by David. Oh, by the way, 69 has a messianic nature there, which we don't have time to talk about, unfortunately. Psalm 109, set a wicked man over him, let accuser stand at his right hand, and so forth. We talked about this, like I say, last week as we introduced it. Let his posterity be cut off, generation following their name be blotted out. The words come to an end, which is what happened to Edom as far as that goes. Okay, now this is kind of Kendall's question. How do we correlate imprecatory psalms with passages that instruct us to love our enemies? Well, last week we talked about 3 suggestions that are not sufficient, that progressive revelation, the Old Testament was less ethical than the New Testament, lower level of morality. That's not sufficient. The indicative mood, it was what would happen, not what the writer wanted to happen. That doesn't fit. And sometimes it's people say, well, you know, God didn't really approve of that, but he wrote it because they said it. Well, it doesn't sound that way. There's a lot of imprecatory psalms there for God just to say, well, you know, I don't really want people to think this way, but I'll include that in the book of Psalms. It doesn't really work. Imprecatory psalms do not address personal vengeance, but rather the psalmist's awareness of God's hatred for sin and his requirement of justice. That is, I think, the main key. That as God hates evil and injustice, so we should too, because God hates it. We certainly shouldn't be in favor. God desires that justice to be done, and because of his power, it will be done. And we should feel that way too. And we should be zealous that God's name not be discredited when the righteous suffer, and those who are not righteous seem to be favored. We don't want people to say, well, you know, if God was really God, why would this happen? Now, a few more keys. Here's what the imprecatory writers did. They aligned themselves with God in those ways that we've already described. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Why? Because you're God's enemies. So this is not a personal thing. This is God. I feel the same way toward evil and injustice that you do. That's what David and some of the other writers felt. The use of poetic language, we have to remember here that poetic language is a little more flowery, a little more metaphors than just saying something outright as we speak today. Daughter of Babylon to be destroyed. Happy the one repays you as you have served us. We looked at that a moment ago. And it's no seeking of personal revenge in these imprecatory psalms. It's not about me. And certainly it should not be about us today as well, as God's people. In return for my love, they are accusers, but I gave myself to prayer. Thus they have rewarded me evil for good and hatred for my love. So in this case, at least, the imprecatory writer seems to have already tried to be loving and forgiving to them. And says, God, I'm turning it over to you now. They seem to know nothing but evil. Imprecatory prayer today, I think we need to be careful. But when we're talking about God, I want you to be a just God. You know, I hate evil. Keep that separated from the sinner. The sin, but not the sinner. Hate evil, but we love everybody. We want everybody to be saved. But sometimes maybe we do feel like David. And we go to God and say, God, here's what's on my heart. But I'm turning it over to you. I will not take personal vengeance because I know that's not right. Thank you for your attention and your comments.